Uh, what we're doing, we're studying the tribe that surrounded, or actually formed a semicircle around the southern part of the land of Palestine at the time that the children of Israel were coming out of Egypt to go into this wonderful land that God had provided for them, that they might learn about God. And we found that there were 7 tribes of people. By the way, I finally made up my mind who the 7th tribe was. The 7 tribes that surrounded it, remember there were 7 tribes inside, which represent those tendencies in our own lives, or propensities that would keep us from enjoying the abundant Christian life. You know, Israel coming out of Egypt stands for the Christian being saved out of the bondage of sin. Going through the wilderness stands for our wilderness journey until we reach the edge of the land, which is the abundant Christian life. It's that place of restful service when the Christian knows he's where God wants him to be and where God can instruct him and use him in his work. That's what it means to be in the promised land or be in the land of Canaan. It's the abundant Christian life. Now, there were 7 tribes which would try to keep the children of Israel out of that land, and there were 7 other tribes inside of the land that they were to dispossess. And we find that the 7 tribes inside represent those propensities which would keep us as Christians from enjoying our Christian life or having fulfillment. They would be things like fear of what people say, and the envy and strife and things that are well up within us that keep us from enjoying the abundant Christian life. And these 7 tribes around the perimeter then represent those things which would keep us from entering in, and those things which would try to dispossess us from the land entirely. And we started with the Philistines because they were first over on this side. And we found that they represent shortcut Christianity, or that nominal Christianity which denies the necessity of admitting that you're a lost sinner in Egypt, that denies the need for the sacrificial lamb, that denies the need for being saved out of sin's grasp, and it denies the need for the wilderness journey. They're the ones that say, well, we're already here. We don't need all that. We're here. And we considered that it might very well be called modernism and that type of thing in the Christian community, but particularly that aspect of Christianity that is recognized as Christianity by the world, as the world looks upon Christianity and Christian leadership. And we found out some of the things that happen to you if the Philistines get you. You become spiritually blind, and you end up, so to speak, grinding corn for the Philistines, like Samson did. But we found all the ways, we followed through all of the lessons, all the stories in the Bible about the Philistines to arrive at this. We found much ammunition, of course. Then our next tribe was the Amalekites. And we find that they represent the old nature, as it would well up in us and assert itself and keep us from possessing the land. And then we've come to the 3rd tribe, which would have kept them out of the land, and these are the Midianites. And we've been right in the middle of the Midianites, and we have suggested that the Midianites stand for what we call structured Christianity. Now, evidently, I haven't been able to get across to everybody yet just what I mean by that, and so I'll try to give some examples. Someone asked last week, for instance, what's the difference between the Midianites and the Philistines as far as our activity? Well, you find out the difference by what they did. For instance, the Midianites were eventually utterly destroyed, but not the Philistines. The Philistines would represent, for instance, that the tares among the wheat, and God said, let them both grow together. And then the angels at the end will decide. We're not trying to, it's not the church's job to try to obliterate modernism or that type of professing Christianity. God has a purpose for it, although they form a buffer, you might say, between the world and fundamental Christianity. And God says, let them alone, just let them grow. And you don't be one of them, but you might pluck up some of the true Israelites. They're more or less that. See, the Israelites stand for true spiritual Christians, as far as if they're in the land, that is. Then the Midianites stand for that propensity which we have to organize our way out of spirituality. I'll try to give you an example. And you find a lot of this Midianitism, you might say, in a Philistine-type church. But let's just take some examples. For instance, before I was saved, I was very active in a church. And we had one of the committees, or commissions as they were called, which was called the Commission on Church Resources. And it was our job to sit down together as a committee and evaluate the financial worth of every family in the church, so that we might have some idea of how much we could count on for giving. And we'd actually, when we had our organized every member canvass, it was called, we organized the whole church. In fact, this would take about a month every year, and it was a very highly organized thing. And you'd go out, you'd have captains, and you'd have, in the terminology of the Midianites, you'd have captains of thousands and captains of hundreds and captains of 50s, and on down until the little guy down on the end, he'd only have about 4 or 5 people to contact, you know. And he would already know about how much he should expect to ask for towards the church budget for the next year, because the Resources Commission had appraised the situation on each one. In other words, they were really organized on how to get the money out of the people and flow it into God's work, you see. And boy, some of the work God did, you'd be surprised. But as far as it was concerned, well, that's the type of thing I mean. And I'll give you another example. Another large denomination. Now, this is the general system used by one of our large denominational type churches for raising money. It's the most effective way that they have. Now, another large denominational group, several years ago, had a program in their Sunday school that was called Divide and Multiply. This was the name of the program. And the idea was that if you got a Sunday school with just, if it got up over 8 or 10 members, the whole idea was to divide it in two. Then you could put 2 teachers to work, and you'd have 2 people out getting the churches bigger. It was a system for growth, and it was a highly organized system. And they may still use it, I don't know, but it caused some furor in some of the churches in this particular denominational group, among some of the bigger classes that had been there. But it was called Divide and Multiply. Some of you might have been involved in such a program. But it's structuring God's work, organizing it along human lines. It's trying to do God's work in human ways. As far as I can tell, this is what the Midianites represent. And if you get involved in that, you'll never make it to the Promised Land. And if you happen to be in the Promised Land and you get mixed up in that type of thing, you'll lose the joy of your salvation, because you'll be working in a structure, in an organization. Now, in case you're I gave you extreme examples, although they're examples that happen to be knowledgeable to me. And this is just the beginning. I told you last week about being asked to head up the Commission for the Coordination of Commissions, because the organizational structure got so top-heavy that you had to have somebody to coordinate it. And but we have this propensity now, even in our best religious groups, and even in our most fervent activities, we have this propensity to move off in that direction. Organize committees, organize groups, and structure God's work. Well, this grieves the Holy Spirit. It's trying to do by human resources some of the things that are the work of the Spirit of God through Christians. Now, as best I know, this is what the Midianites stand for. in the Bible. And, of course, for those of you that weren't here, we've had these stories. Of course, the Bible is just full of Midianites, unfortunately, or as the case may be, it really is. We found, first, that Midian was the fourth son of Abraham and Keturah, born to the wife that Abraham married after Sarah's death. And then the next time we run across the Midianites is when they bought Joseph and sold him as a slave down into Egypt. And Midianites are commercial. They sell the souls of men. They commercialize. Now, they don't know this, and they don't even know they're doing it intentionally. But the system, the Midianite system that we're speaking of, this structured system, organizational system, tends to do that. It sells the souls of men because it involves them in religious activity without bringing them to Christ. And to get money to do that, and to expound upon that and expand upon that. I'll give you another example. Back soon after I was saved, I was in a church which was a pretty good example, I would think, of the Midianites. And there was a fervent young missionary that went down to Costa Rica to language school. And he belonged to this denomination. He was a saved boy. And his name was Lloyd Knox. Some of you may have met him. And he was going to be a missionary in Cuba. Well, about that time, things got unfavorable in Cuba. So he stayed on in Costa Rica. And his denominational group had a school ministry on the islands of the Gulf of Nicosia, which is on the Pacific side of Costa Rica. And carrying on an evangelical work in that same area is an organization known as the Central America Mission, CAM. Well, there's a Lakeland couple who are missionaries for CAM in that island group. They're in Spain now, the Ritchies, Dick Ritchie. But they had an evangelistic mission down in the on these islands, where the denomination also had a school operation going, which at one time, no doubt, was established along evangelical lines, but had long since passed that stage. But anyway, as it so happens, Lloyd was telling me, they both had a desperate need for a new boat to carry on the ministry. Well, Dick Ritchie got down on his knees and told God all about it because he didn't have any way to get a boat. But Lloyd Knox and his group wrote to the Board of World Missions and headquartered in New York and told them of their need. And they got a letter back and told them that they had been put on the roll and the waiting list, and when their time came around and the funds came in, well, they'd consider it, and the board would sit and they'd decide whether or not they could send the boat down. Well, in the meantime, the Lord sent Dick a boat in a most miraculous manner, and here he is going all over the Gulf preaching the gospel in his boat, and here's Lloyd, he says, still waiting for the Board of World Missions to operate. And so this is an example, you see. One, strictly a faith missionary. Now, I don't know what you know about CAM, but it operates the same way as Trans World Radio and Africa Inland Mission and so forth. Each missionary is responsible to raise his own support. And there's no slush fund. There's no, if you need some equipment, you don't write to the mission board and say, please send me the boat. No, you tell the Lord, going. Isn't that right? Am I saying it right? You send the message that way, don't you? You don't send it that way. And so he was telling about this in the church. I'll just call it I'll call it the Midianite church that I was in. But he was telling about this, and he said something's wrong with our system. When our people have to sit down there and write letter after letter and beg and cajole, and we're the richest, and he said this, we're the richest church denomination in all the world, he said. Now, I doubt it. I expect there's one other one that I won't name that's probably richer. But anyway, he says, and he says, this poor fella that doesn't have anywhere to get his funds from, but on his knees, he says, here he is, got his. Now see, that's how you kill the work of the Spirit, through structuring God's work. Now I hope you get the point of what we're saying. And as best I know, this is what the Midianites stand for. Now, so you see, we had the story of selling Joseph, and then the next time we came across the Midianites, Moses married one of them. And remember, when he married up with the Midianites, he was out of operation as far as saving God's people for 40 years. And then remember, the Midianites didn't want anything to do with spiritual things like circumcision. That didn't mean a thing in the world to that Midianite woman, and she got mad and left her husband over it, if you remember. Then the next time we find, here's old Moses. He led the children of Israel out of Egypt, and there he was in the desert. And his father-in-law, this Midianite priest he was telling him how to organize this group of people, remember. He said, now you do it this way. And he had a beautiful, this was the 18th chapter of Exodus, had a beautiful organization. And Moses says, well, that sounds like a good idea. And so he organized them along that line. God didn't pay any attention to it, and Moses still had problems. He had to finally cry out to God and say, God, this is too much for me. And God says, all right, now you're ready to do it my way. Well, we'll find you 70 elders, and I'll put part of the Spirit that's on you on each one of them. And so he came to God and did it God's way, and God didn't pay any attention to the Midianite system. So here we have, in the 10th chapter of Numbers, we have our next story about the Midianites. And this one involves a Midianite who was Moses' brother-in-law. Numbers chapter 10, verse 29. And Moses said unto Hobab, the son of Raguel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are journeying unto the place of which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come thou with us, and we will do thee good, for the Lord hath spoken good concerning Israel. And he said unto him, I will not go, but I will depart to mine own land and to mine own kindred. And he, that is Moses, said, leave us not, I pray thee, forasmuch as thou knowest how we are to encamp in the wilderness, and thou mayest be unto us instead of I. Now, this is a very astounding suggestion by Moses, we said last week, in view of the fact that God had carried them all the way now. He'd been with them now for some 14 months, and with the pillar of cloud, or leading their every step by this pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. Now let's go back over the 9th chapter and just read. This is just one of the several places where this leading is discussed. Numbers 9:15. And on the day that the tabernacle was reared up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, namely the tent of the testimony, and at evening there was upon the tabernacle, as it were, the appearance of fire until the morning. So it was always, the cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. And when the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, then after the children of Israel journeyed, and in the place where the cloud abode, there the children of Israel pitched their tents. At the command of the Lord, the children of Israel journeyed, and the command of the Lord they pitched. So long as the cloud abode upon the tabernacle, they rested in their tents, and when the cloud tarried long upon the tabernacle many days, then the children of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and journeyed not. And so it was, when the cloud was a few days upon the tabernacle, according to the commandment of the Lord, they abode in their tents, and according to the commandment of the Lord they journeyed. And so it was. And when the cloud abode from evening until morning, and that the cloud was taken up in the morning, then they journeyed. Whether it was by day or by night, that the cloud was taken up, they journeyed. Or whether it were 2 days or a month or a year, that the cloud tarried upon the tabernacle, remaining thereon, the children of Israel abode in their tents, and journeyed not. But when it was taken up, they journeyed. At the commandment of the Lord, they rested in their tents, and the commandment of the Lord, they journeyed. They kept the charge of the Lord at the commandment of the land by the hand, the commandment of the Lord by the hand of Moses. Now, the Lord had told Moses that he was going to do this, and he'd been doing it for 14 months now. And so here Moses, in trepidation, was leading this great mass of people, 11 days' journey, we're told in the 1st chapter of Deuteronomy, from the Mount Sinai, where they were, up to the edge of the land, from way down in the peninsula here that we showed you before, up to the edge of the land. It says it was 11 days' journey. And they had gone a couple of days, I believe, when they reached this place. See, back in the 10th chapter, the 11th verse. And it came to pass on the 20th day of the 2nd month of the 2nd year that the cloud was taken up from off the tabernacle of the testimony. The children of Israel took their journey out of the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud rested in the wilderness of Paran, and they took their journey according to the commandment of the Lord and by the hand of Moses. And if you read this through, I believe you'll find that first trip they took was 2 days, or 2.5 days, and it may be in the recap Moses gives in Deuteronomy. But anyway, the Lord had already led them this far. And then Hobab came. They got to the land of the Midianites. And Moses says, look, Hobab says, you really know this country around here. And so, look, we might get lost. So how about you being our guide? See, Moses was wanting to lean on a human arm. He just couldn't quite have the faith that cloud was going to stay there and lead them all the way. Of course, if you read the rest of this, God didn't pay any attention to that. He knew Moses would be faithful when he got the point. Let's read on here. We're in chapter 10, verse 32. And it shall be, if thou shalt go with us, yea, it shall be that what goodness the Lord shall do unto us, the same he will do unto thee. Now, it never tells us whether or not Hobab went with us. We see him later on, or assumably it's him, later on, or his children, his descendants years later. But we sort of gather, if you read this carefully, that Hobab didn't go with him. He might have, I don't know. But whether he did or not, the Lord just completely ignored his so-called leadership. And notice what happened. Verse 33. And they departed from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them in the 3 days' journey to search out a resting place for them. See? It says the Lord searched out a resting place, not Hobab. He didn't. It was the pillar of cloud that went before them. And the priest with the ark of the covenant followed the pillar of cloud. Verse 34. And the cloud of the Lord was upon them by day, and when they went out of the camp, and it came to pass, when the ark set forward, that Moses said, Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee before thee. And when it rested, he said, Return, O Lord, and so forth. So here they went on their journey. Now, it took them a lot more than 11 days to go that 11 days journey, because they had all kind of trouble. They had rebellions, and they had a group that wanted to go back to Egypt, and a group that thought they ought to be prophets, and then we had the problem of Miriam and Moses' sister thinking Moses was taking over too much authority, and they just had all kind of problems. It took them months to go that 11 days, even to get to the edge of the wilderness. And then you'll remember the story of how they wouldn't go in because of and then the Amalekites got them, remember? And so they turned back into the wilderness. And our next story involving Midianites happens 38 years later or so, when the children of Israel are right over here in the bottom of this green area, right here, ready to cross over the River Jordan into the land. They're right in here, in this area here. And we find Midianites the next time in Numbers chapter 22. Now, at first reading, this chapter would seem to be mostly about the Moabites. Now, that's going to be a group. See, we do Philistines, Amalekites, Midianites, Edomites, and Moabites. They're number 5, and we'll get to the Moabites. There's just about as much in the Bible about Moabites as there are Midianites. It really is something to think about, isn't it? That God put so many stories in the Bible about these various tribes. They must stand for something, especially when we consider, as we've said before, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, which says that all of these things happened unto them for examples, and they are written down for our admonition upon whom the ends of the world have come. So we should pay attention when we see so much. Well, these chapters that we're going to have here are about the ministry of that strange man named Balaam. And we think of him as having been hired by the Moabites. And if we just read this loosely, we'd think that the Moabites were the stars of the show here, you might say. But let's look at chapter 22. And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in the plains of Moab on this side of the Jordan by Jericho. That's right here across the river from Jericho. But notice, well, let's just go ahead and read. And Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Now, we skipped over part of this, but what had happened? The children of Israel had failed to go into the land when they made that 11 days journey that took them several months. And they had circled around. Every tribe refused to let them through. The Edomite says, no, you can't go through us. The Moabite says, no, you can't go through us. And they came way around through this desert. And they entered into this purple part here. And at that time, this land here was occupied by one of the kings of the Amorites. Now, the Amorites actually lived over in the land. They were one of the 7 tribes in the land. But they were the most powerful tribe in the land, and they had kind of splashed over and taken some land from the Moabites. Now, the land of the Moabites should be all the land that's immediately east of the Dead Sea. But at this particular time, the Amorites from over here had come and pushed them down. You can read the story of how it happened and everything. If you don't want to read the whole story in Numbers, read the synopsis in Deuteronomy. By the way, if you just want to get a synopsis of everything that happened here, read it in Deuteronomy, because that's where Moses is telling it to the second generation. And it's condensed there somewhat. But it'll tell you that the Amorites came and shoved the Moabites south and squeegeed them into about half of their land. So at the time the Israelites came along, they were only occupying the part from the river Arnon, which is right here, south. See, that word's Moab right there. And so the Moabites at this time were occupying the yellow part of this land just east of the Dead Sea. And the Amorites had spilled over into this purple part, and their king over here was Sihon. And then they had also spilled over into this vast area, the part that's green and pink. And that was all ruled by King Og, who was an Amorite. The Amorites had really gotten more all over here. So when the children of Israel, some 3 million of them, were trying to get into the land, they came up to Sihon's territory here, this purple part, and they said, look, King, we'll just go on the road. All the water we drink, we'll pay for all the anyway. Says, we'll kill you. God turned them over into his hands. Now, if you see in Numbers, that's in chapter 21, verse 21. And Israel sent messengers unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, let me pass through the land, and so forth. And he was to completely slaughter that king and all of his people. And the Israelites then came and occupied this purple part. And then they went on up here, and conquered King Og, so that they had this part too. Now that made Moab get rather squeamish. And this is where we are in the 22nd chapter, where Balak, the king of Moab, is having some problems here. Notice in the 3rd verse. And Moab was sorely afraid of the people because they were many, and Moab was distressed because the children of Israel, and Moab said unto the elders of Midian, now shall this company lick up all that are around about us, as the ox licketh up the grass of the field. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at the time. Now here's a strange thing about Midianites. They always work in consort with somebody. They like to join up with somebody. They don't care whether it's the evangelical people or whether it's the cults or who it is. You were going to find out pretty soon that the Moabite stands for false cults. And they don't care who they join up with. But they always have a connection. They operate in consort with somebody. See, that's the reason they were so interested in joining up with the Israelites back here and marrying into them and so forth. When they took, remember when they captured, or when they bought Joseph, they were joined up with the Ishmaelites. Well, you're going to find that all through. That's just one of the propensities of the Midianites. They're never their own man. They're always in cohorts with somebody else. And here, they're joined up with the Moabites. And actually, at this time, the Moabites were a rather small people. And the Midianites were fabulously wealthy, we're going to find out, and a great people. So the Moabites had gone to see the Midianites. And I guess they needed some of that structuring. They said, look, God's leading these children of Israel here, and they're a great horde of people. And they're so many they could just lick us up, like an ox licks up grass, they said. And you Midianites, there are a lot of you too, and you could help us out. So let's get together on this thing. And so the Moabites went to the leaders of Midianites and said, look, let's do something about this. So notice the 7th verse of the 22nd chapter. And the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the reward of divination in their hand, and they came unto Balaam. Now here's what they did. The Midianite elders said to the Moabites, now wouldn't you have been scared? Now you just had the stuffing beat out of you by the Amorites and had half your land taken away by them. And now here was this other great horde of people that had defeated the armies, so to speak, of Egypt, the greatest power on earth. And here they were, camping on your doorstep. Now what the Moabites didn't know was that God had said, I don't want you to touch those Moabites, because I've given them that land, and I don't want you to touch them. Don't want you to hurt them in any way. I don't want you to have anything to do with them, but I don't want you to bother them. And so they really didn't have anything to worry about. We're going to see that when we study the Moabites. God had told them not to have any relationships with the Moabites and not to bother them, and stay away from their land, not even to fight them in any way. And so the Moabites were afraid for nothing. Of course, they don't really know God. But they knew that those Midianites knew how to get things done. So this is the reason they went to see him. And so the Midianite elders told the Moabite elders, says, I'll tell you what you do. You go get this priest. His name is Balaam. And he knows how to figure out all these things. And he'll tell you what to do. And remember, they went and got Balaam, and Balaam told him, I can't help you. I can't do anything unless God lets me do it. And they said, oh, now, Balaam, don't be that way. We got buku bunch of money. And you come on back with us, and we'll pay you well. And Balaam sort of pricked up his ears, and he began to beg the Lord and say, now, Lord says, why don't you let me go? Look, this is a pretty healthy wad here this guy's offering me. And so the Lord let him go. And remember, that's when the angel stood in the way of the donkey. And because Balaam knew that God didn't want him to go. But he went anyhow. And, Balaam told him, well, I can't curse those. Those are God's people. And then he caught their ear and he said, now, I'll tell you what you will do. I'll tell you how to really ruin the Israelites. You get all your best-looking young single girls, and you send them into the camp of Israelites and tell those girls to seduce them, those men. And says, because the one thing God has said, that no Israelite young man shall have an affair with any of the women in the other land. And says, if you do that now, they'll not be able to resist it because you got some lookers. And that's the way God will turn against them. And God will have to defeat them for you. So you do that. That's what Balaam told the Midianites and the Moabites. And so that's what they did. And we find all kind of problems. Look at chapter 25. And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom or harlotry with the daughters of Moab, and they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat and bowed down to their gods, and Israel joined himself to Baal, for it just happened just like Balaam said it was. And then God had to bring judgment against the Israelites. Now notice the 6th verse. And behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses. And so he had just like Balaam had said, get these young girls from Midian and young girls from Moab and get them down there in the camp of the Israelites and get them to seduce those young men, and then God will be against them. And so he brought this judgment that way upon them. Now, surprisingly enough, God tells Moses that he's got to do something about this. Notice in chapter 31 in Numbers. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites. Now, he doesn't say the Moabites and the Midianites. He says the Midianites. You see, they're the ones that really organized this deal. Avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites. Afterward, thou shalt be gathered unto thy people. And Moses spoke unto the people, saying, arm some of yourselves unto the war, and let them go against the Midianites, and avenge the Lord of Midian. And so if you read on here, you'll find that they went against the Midianites, the people of Israel did, And they killed all they came in contact with except the young girls. And they took them captive, took all their animals captive and all their metals, the gold and silver and all of that captive. Now, did you notice this? When God sent against the Amalekites to wipe them utterly off the earth, absolutely obliterate everything that has to do with Amalek. And yet he said, although I'm telling you to do that, you're going to have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Well, you see, this is the same as saying God telling us to crucify the old man. But yet even if we crucify him, we have war with him as long as we're on this earth from generation to generation. And God has to eventually do him in. God never told the Israelites that they would destroy Amalek. He said he would eventually. That's the job of the Holy Spirit of God. And Amalek will never be done in completely in our own lives until we realize that the Holy Spirit of God must do that for us. But now he didn't say completely obliterate Midian. Didn't say that. They were able to keep all of their cattle and so forth. Because you see, there are some usable things about Midianitism. We don't want to be without order and structure entirely, do we? The whole deal is that you be in control of the structure instead of the structure being in control of you. And that's what happens, you see, so many times in our churches. The structure gets the power, and you begin working for the structure rather than vice versa. How do you know when that's happening? When the church is not doing what a church is supposed to do, winning souls. They're too busy operating in the structure rather than doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, the children of Israel went against the Midianites, not against the Moabites. They were told not to touch the Moabites, just the Midianites. And look what they ended up with. Chapter 31, verse 32. And the booty, being the rest of the prey, which the men of war had caught, was 600,000 and 70,000 and 5,000 sheep. That's 675,000 sheep, 72,000 oxen, 61,000 asses or donkeys. Boy, they really took the booty. And if you read on down here, it was gold all over the place. They really, really, really took it. Now, what happened? With all that cattle, some of the Israelites began to say, look, we're pretty wealthy. I think we're pretty off where do we want to go across the Jordan River for? Hey, look, this is a land to graze cattle in. I know God said that that's the place he wants us, over across the Jordan, the place of rest and so forth. But why not let well enough alone? Why not stay here? Notice this, chapter 32. Now they got the wealth of the Midianites. That's one thing about Midianites. They really have possessions. You know, it's sort of like the church at Laodicea in the 3rd chapter of Revelation. We're rich and have need of nothing. Well, this is the circumstances of the Midianites. They got the dough. Chapter 32. Now the children of Reuben, that's one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the children of Gad had a very great multitude of cattle. Where did they get them? They got them from the Midianites and some from the other people they destroyed there. And when they saw the land of Jazer, that's over here, and the land of Gilead, that behold, the place was a place for cattle. And the children of Gad and the children of Reuben came and spoke unto Moses and to Eleazar the priest and unto the princes of the congregation, and so forth. And watch the 4th verse. Even the country which the Lord smote before the congregation of Israel is a land for cattle, and thy servants have cattle. Wherefore, they said, if we have found grace in thy sight, Moses, let this land over here be given unto thy servants for a possession, and bring us not over the Jordan. Now, if you read this chapter carefully, and particularly the condensed version of it in Deuteronomy, and you watch the language closely, every time it speaks of the land on the east side of the river that Gad and Manasseh and Reuben wanted, it says that Moses gave them. And every time it speaks of the land over here, it says that God gave them. Now God permitted Moses to give these this land over here. Just like he permits things now, just like in the Israelites. You know, he sent them their requests, the desires of their hearts, but brought leanness into their souls. These tribes over here sold out for possessions. And of course, that's one of the things that'll keep you right out of the promised land. And that's having too high a regard for your possessions. And this is Midianitism. Because you see, you get your possessions through this structure, whether you're a church or whether you're an individual. And if you regard your possessions too much, you'll never cross River Jordan. And they didn't. You can read the story in 2 Chronicles, I believe it's chapter 17. Let's see, I have it listed. No, 1 Chronicles chapter 5. And these over here were the first ones that went into idolatry and were taken captive by the Assyrians. The ones that never went. Now they said, look, Moses, we're perfectly glad to go over here and help fight. We're right in the battle. But don't make us live over there. You see, that's the kind of a Christian that says, oh, I don't mind being a part of God's program, but let me live my own life. Let me make my own decisions about where I live and what I do and what I do with my possessions. And then if I can be of some help, I'll be glad to come down on Saturday and help mow the church lawn or what have you, see, or give to the missionaries or what have you. Well, I'm right with you now. I'm part of God's program. And these went across the river to help possess the land, but they didn't want to live there. They left their families over here. And they went over to do God's work. This speaks of a Christian that fooled around with the Midianites and their possessions so long because they have a higher regard for the possessions. And we see church and church groups and Christian organizations like this, you know. They get so enamored with how big their church is and how plush it is and all of this and what they have, and they brag about their youth camp and their great colleges and all the things that they have. They don't need God. What do you need God for if you got all this? For this was Church of Laodicea, you see. This is what this brings to you. It's running God's work like man runs his own work. That's what Midianitism is. Well, the next story we find about the Midianites happens a couple of hundred years later. And it's in the book of Judges, and all of you are familiar with it, and we're not going to have time to really go through it. But it starts with Judges chapter 6. Let's just read a verse or two. We were in Numbers, then Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. Judges is the seventh book. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. Now here we find the Midianites joined up with the Amalekites, see? And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made themselves the dens which are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. And so it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites and the children of the east, even they came up against them. Look what they did. They encamped against them and destroyed the increase. Now here's what happens. When God's people turn away from God and quit depending upon Him for everything, the Midianites come in. And here's what they do. They let you sow and grow, and they come in and reap. And this is what the Midianites, in fact, that's why the Midianites were so rich. They didn't farm their own land. What they did, they traveled around until they saw a tribe or a group of people that were diligent farmers. And they'd pitch over here, and they'd wait till the crops got just ripe, and then they'd accommodate that country by coming in and harvesting their crops for them and fill their own coffers. And this is what was happening there. And God permitted it because the people quit trusting God, quit relying upon Him. And this will happen if your church starts trying to run on its organization and quit depending just strictly upon the hand of God or your Christian organization, whatever it is, what'll happen is God's work will stop. There won't be any harvest. See, it says right here in the 4th verse, destroyed the increase. After Israel had sown, Israel stands for the spiritual people. They sow, but the Midianites come in and reap and get the church members. Midianite churches really grow. They know how to organize so that church grows and expands and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And most of their members come from the Israelites. The Israelites are out, or the spiritual people are out, spreading the gospel and so forth, and the people end up in a Midianite church because they are structured to know how to grow. The spiritual people sow, and the organization ensnares them and funnels them into its organization. Got to go. We got to get big. Divide and multiply. Let's go. Now, how do you combat something like that? Well, you know the story, don't you, of Gideon, how God called a man from the least of the tribes, and you might say, and he said, I'm the least of the tribes, because I couldn't do anything. And finally, God says, yes, you could. And he raised Gideon up against the Midianites and the Amalekites. They were in conjunction with him here. And remember, they gathered together 32,000 warriors from out of Israel. God says, that's too many. You can't fight my way. Now, you could fight the Midianites in the way of the Midianites with 32,000. You can't do it my way with 32,000. That's too many. Send all the fearful home, or all those that want to leave, send them home. And 22,000 of them went home. Only left 10,000 to fight those hordes and hordes of Midianites. God says that's too many. If I were to let you take 10,000 men and go against the Midianites and let you win, you'd think that it was from your own prowess. Well, that's too many. And he gave them a little experiment about drinking water, and they ended up with 300. He said, now you'll know that I'll have to do it. And then he didn't let them use weapons of war, remember? All they could use was an earthen pitcher with a candle like in it and a horn. Well, see, this is a picture of Christ, the light of the world, in an earthen vessel, that's us, and being proclaimed. Christ proclaimed in an earthen vessel, proclaimed. And this is God's way of winning wars. And remember how one of these Midianites dreamed a dream, and then the other one says, well, sounds like something bad's going to happen. And then God told Gideon what to do, and they sounded their horns, and the Midianites jumped up, and the Midianites killed the Moabites, and not the Moabites, but the Amalekites, and the Amalekites killed the Midianites, and they had a happy time slaughtering each other. And then the Israel took out after them, and they raised a great army and followed them down. And if you read the story, not a one of the Israelites was killed. And did you know that's the end of the history of the Midianites in the whole Bible? Because Israel possessed the land after that, and you will not find the Midianites again. Now you find the Amalekites and Philistines. You will find them mentioned 6 more times, but it's always referring to that great battle of Gideon when they were conquered. The Midianites are described in 1 Kings, in Psalms 83, 3 times in Isaiah, and once in Habakkuk. And it refers you back to that day. Now let's turn, in closing, to our 83rd Psalm again, and tie this right in with our modern history as well as our spiritual lesson. Psalm 83. I've told you before that whether or not this is intended to be so or not, to me, it's an exact description of the situation immediately before the recent 6 days war. As far as I'm concerned, it describes that situation in absolute positive detail. Now watch. This is Israel praying to God, and when Israel prays, they call their enemies God's enemies, and vice versa. Keep not thou silent, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God, for lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. Now, this term hidden ones is very interesting, because Israel are the hidden ones at this time. They're described that way in various places in the Bible. In other words, they weren't the hidden ones when the psalm was written, but they are now. And this really ties it in to our day. Now listen to what these enemies of Israel, when they took counsel, what they said. And they have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation. Are those familiar words? Let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel...
We're sorry, but this was the end of the original tape.